Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. I got a cool article that had a pretty nice headline which reads, "Revealed Genetic Secrets of High-Ranked Warriors at a Medieval German Burial Site." When I read into this, I realized that this takes place at a time in history between the modern era and classical antiquity. So basically century antiquity ends around, it's the time of the Romans, and it ends at about the 6th century AD, 7th century AD, around then. So this subject matter deals with a group called the Alemanni that were at the time a conglomeration of German tribes that were united under the banner Alemanni or Swabian for a couple hundred years until the Franks came at the end of the 5th century, 497 AD, and they took over. And then from there, the Alemanni their culture changed, and they knew that their culture changed because in part because of the reason of how they did their burials. So before they were taken over, they were buried one way, and then once they got taken over by the Franks, they were buried another way. And there's a specific site that is the target of this discussion that we'll get into in a second. The reason why I point out the time in history was, that's kind of the point of this video, is history, right? But it's also right before something that's called the Dark Ages, and it kind of spills into the Dark Ages a little bit. And what the Dark Ages are, it's a period in history in which very little is written down or documented that we know of. Because of that, I would just like to I would like you guys to keep that in mind as we go through this article. Now, just as a quick reference, here's a photo that shows the area settled by the Alemanni and some sites of Roman Alemannic battles between the 3rd and 6th centuries. Now, this group was at war with the Romans for a while, and they were actually pretty successful. They didn't get completely taken over. And as you can see, it's the Upper Rhine River. They're the Germanic tribes that occupy those areas, and eventually they just got together. So it was kind of, when you talk about barbarian tribes, we don't know exactly how organized they are. Compared to the Romans, they're not nearly as organized. However, there were a lot of them, and they do figure into a more pronounced role, a more important role in history than people tend to give two thoughts about. So I want to read from the actual research article here, which is titled "Ancient Genome-Wide Analyses and for Kinship Structure in an Early Medieval Alemannic Graveyard." So they chose this site called Niederstatzingen, which is a 7th century AD burial ground, which is in Germany. And it's divided into two parts, the south and the north. What they wanted to find out was they wanted to elucidate the kinship structure because it had not yet been directly tested at a genomic level. They had an idea of what the kinship structure was back then, which is basically if you're in the family or if you're directly appointed by the family in whatever capacity, then you had these kinship rights, and you were buried in an Alemannic funerary practice, basically. And they chose this site, Niederstatzingen, because it's the most complete and richest example of the Alemannic funerary practice that we just mentioned. So in what the researchers wanted to do, they wanted to take 13 individuals who were buried, and they were buried with a bunch of stuff. Like, I'm talking about jewelry, armor, swords, tools, apparel, shields, all that stuff. And these artifacts weren't made in-house. I mean, they came from all over. So in this specific example, they came from either France, northern Italy, or Byzantium. So these are all Roman occupied lands. What the study wanted to do, again, they wanted to sequence, they wanted to analyze the genome-wide sequences recovered from the remains, and also they wanted to cross-examine it with the archaeological context, and then from there they want to put to rest what the kinship structure was and what the extent of their outside contact was. So how many people from outside their culture were invited into their culture, and not just as slaves or anything, but actually legitimate participants in their social, I guess, hierarchy or how the status quo of their society, so to speak. So what they found out in this study, and I won't get too into it, but just very quickly, 11 of the individuals had sufficient DNA preservation to genetically sex them as male. So 11 of the 13 they knew for sure were male, and then the other 2, it's kind of ambiguous. And then they also identified 9 unique mitochondrial haplotypes. So there are 9 different mothers, I guess, or 9 different lineages of moms, and then 2 distinct Y chromosome lineages, so 2 men's Y chromosome lineages. Genome-wide analyses were performed on 8 individuals to estimate genetic affiliation to modern West Eurasians and genetic kinship at burial. And then 5 of them were direct relatives of West Eurasians. And then 3 other individuals were not detectably related. So of the 3 people who were not related, 2 of them were more related to Southern Europeans and the people from the Mediterranean. By Southern European, I mean in this case it's Spain. The genetic makeup of these individuals, there's no observable pattern with their orientation in the burial or the cultural association of their grave goods, with the 5 related individuals buried with grave goods associated with 3 diverse cultural origins. Let me kind of unpack that. So, I mentioned earlier that there's a site that was the northern site and the southern site. So the northern site were where the 5 related individuals were from. So they were either brother and sister or cousins. So they were buried in the north, and they found out that their DNA is very closely related with people from Lithuania and Iceland specifically. So it's safe to say that they were actually a family. From the south, there were non-related individuals who did not have DNA from the aforementioned DNA, not Northern European. They were Southern European from Spain and the Mediterranean. However, what they had in common were the cultural association of their grave goods, meaning there was no observable pattern, there was no rhyme or reason to why they were buried with what. So basically what I'm trying to say is, just because this group was related, that did not mean that's why they got the goods that they were given. Same thing with the unrelated people. So it seemed like there had to be some other societal reason for them besides outside of kinship for the reason why they got these burials that they did. So the findings support the idea that not only were kinship and fellowship held in equal regard, so family or a close friend, but diverse cultural appropriation was practiced among closely related individuals as well. Very interesting. The rest of the article kind of goes over the background of the Alemanni, and then they got defeated by Clovis I of the Franks in 497, and then they became a subsumed duchy of the Merovingian kingdom. And then 5th to 8th century AD, the integration between the Franks and the Alemanni was affected by the change in burial practices, also called with households or familia buried in richly furnished graves. Because of this, you can kind of see the kinship structure, wealth, and status, and also the power of the Franks, obviously, because they believed in a system of power based on personal relations rather than fixed territory. It's really interesting that it kind of sheds a different light on how things were arranged back then. So the Franks, when they could have very easily done what Genghis Khan did and just obliterate everybody who weren't on the same page. But it seems here that they it was more of a society based on merit and trust than on inheritance or provenance. Basically, you're from this patch of dirt, so you're either the enemy or you're an ally or whatever. So I wouldn't have really understood that if it weren't for genomic evidence and genomic research. Okay, if I was, say, someone with money and these group of researchers came up to me and said, hey, we want to find out more about kinship. This is what we do know. Here's what has been assumed. I mean, they were buried with all this stuff. It's pretty obvious that they had all these artifacts from other places. because of their culture, and it's obvious that these cultures met, but we still want to do some genetic digging. We want to study their genetics and see where they really came from, and see what else we can find out. If I was a rich guy with limited resources, I probably wouldn't put money in that, just because I feel like I would have felt like there wasn't much to learn. There's no upside. But boy, am I wrong, because there's a lot of stuff to glean from this. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, they don't call it the Dark Ages for nothing. I mean, there's a lot of gaps that we haven't filled. So this is the reason why I wanted to show this this article is because it's a good example of the benefits of genetic research, in that you're not getting results just at face value. I mean, it's like an iceberg here. There's a lot of stuff that can be gleaned from this, just from observing some genetic strains. What do you guys think? Cultural appropriation did exist back then, and it wasn't necessarily a bad thing like it is, like some people make it out to be today. They were probably in their day-to-day life, they were probably a lot more understanding of each other, I suppose. This is really interesting. I mean, they were more of a melting pot than we think, and they probably were less discriminatory than we think. At least I'm talking about in this snapshot in history, and I'm talking about the Franks. I'm not trying to say this about everybody, but now that we know that this is pretty much fact, it kind of shapes and it alters my view anyway of what things were like back then, and also alerts me to all the stuff that I don't know yet about this area. Just because, the Dark Ages, not a lot of things were recorded. It kind of gives us another resource to mine valuable information from, to sort of, again, put the puzzle pieces together to construct our view. So if you find this interesting, or if you have any questions, or if I've messed something up, or if there's something I left out, please let me know in the comments. And I love responding to them. And give this a thumbs up and stay tuned.